Now, this week was meant to see the agreement of the world's first ever binding treaty to fight plastic pollution. Instead, talks in Geneva organized by the UN Environment Program ended in deadlock. That's due to a split between some 100 nations backed by scientists who want to limit plastic production and oil-producing states led by Saudi Arabia who want to focus on recycling. Plastics are made from fossil fuels, meaning the world's biggest oil producers are also the biggest makers of plastic. A previous round of talks had already collapsed in December, and this latest failure comes as the pollution crisis grows increasingly dire, with microplastics already found in every corner of the world, from the bottom of the ocean to human breast milk. Well, for some insight, we can speak to Bethanie Carney Almroth, a professor of ecotoxicology at the University of Gothenburg. Good morning. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Morning. Happy to be here.
Now, you yourself participated in these negotiations. Your reaction to this failure we saw to reach a deal?
Yeah, I mean, we're disappointed. Of course, we would have liked to see a deal, but we would also like to see a treaty that is effective in fulfilling its mandate to end plastics pollution. And the treaty that was on the table on the last night or the last morning would not have been able to do that. So I would argue that no deal is better than an ineffective deal.
And can you talk more about what went wrong? I mean, who's responsible for the failure to reach a deal in your view?
Treaty negotiations have been held under consensus, so countries have been trying to come to an agreement on what should be included in the treaty. But the red lines that have been drawn by the different groups of countries are so far from each other that they're not able to find consensus. And as you said in your opening, there are more than 100 countries that are asking for ambition in the treaty and for measures that would effectively address plastics pollution, while there are others that generally call themselves the like-minded group that have been essentially blocking the treaty by blocking exactly those effective measures.
And even ahead of this summit, or before these negotiations even started, a lot of NGOs were warning about the influence of lobbyists. Is that something that you've witnessed? I believe you yourself have spoken about being intimidated physically by lobbyists.
So this is something that there's empirical evidence on in the science. I'm a scientist and I attend these meetings with a group of scientists. There are 60 of us on the ground there supporting countries with evidence, with scientific evidence relevant to the policy discussions that were ongoing. But as you said, there are a lot of lobbyists in the room, and there are a lot of corporations and countries with close ties to the petrochemical industry that have vested economic interests in protecting those industries. So there are a number of different tactics that they're using. One of them, as you mentioned, is intimidation. We find that our scientists are being exposed to harassment and intimidation campaigns, but we also see attempts to undermine science and understanding of science. So they're using or weaponizing science to create doubt amongst decision makers, which makes it more difficult for them to know what the truth is, where the evidence lies, and which policies would be most effective. We're trying to support member states in understanding this and trying to help them understand what the science does actually say. But this is a very difficult discussion, difficult battle that we're fighting.
And why have the lobbies been able to gain so much power? I mean, are countries kind of letting themselves be intimidated?
First off, they're in the room. There are industry representatives and lobbyists that are attending these meetings in the same group of attendees as I'm in, which is the Observer Group. And the Observer Group incorporates in this space scientists, NGOs, civil society organizations, indigenous peoples, but also industry representatives. So we're all there in the same space with the same kind of access. But beyond that, industries and corporations have access outside of those rooms to governments, to people in positions of power. They can exert different kinds of pressures than what a scientist can do. They can, of course, lobby governments, while what we do is bring scientific evidence into the room. It's a very different kind of access and a different kind of power that can be exerted.
And tell us a bit about that scientific evidence. I mean, these groups, these other countries like Saudi Arabia are arguing to focus on recycling. Why is that insufficient?
Yeah, so first off, the mandate does call for addressing plastics pollution across the entire life cycle. And the life cycle of plastics begins with extraction and production. So extraction of raw materials, 98 to 99% of plastics are currently produced from fossil fuels. So already there, pollution is occurring as emissions of gases, of toxic chemicals, of micro and nanoplastics occur at that stage in the plastics life cycle. Then emissions continue to occur along the entire life cycle as plastics are traded and transported as as products are manufactured using these materials in the consumer's hands, where these releases of chemicals and particles continue to the waste phase. And this is where some countries are focusing, very far downstream at the waste phase. And while improving waste management is very important, it will not completely address all of the upstream measures and all the upstream sources of plastics pollution. So science tells us that one of the most important steps in ending plastic pollution is reducing the amount of plastics that we're producing. Right now, we're producing more than 500 million tons per year, and this is beyond what our planet can tolerate and beyond what human bodies can tolerate and beyond what our societies are capable of managing. So those are very important upstream measures. Another essential would be to address the chemicals in plastics. Plastics are very chemically complex materials. It can contain thousands of chemicals that we know are hazardous and can cause health impacts, both in humans but also in organisms in the environment. And there are more than 10,000 chemicals that we don't have good data on. So we don't even really know what's in the products that we're using and attempting to recycle.
And what's next for these talks? I mean, is there hope of a treaty finally being agreed further down the line?
I did see a lot of countries coming together around some of the most important issues as the ones I've just described. And there were more than 100 countries that were supporting some of these measures. So there is a majority in the world's nations that want to do this and want to do it properly. The end of the meeting ended with a call for a continuation of the negotiations, time and place to be determined. But there's a risk that continuing along these lines with trying to find consensus will not bring us to a treaty, as I described these red lines being so far from each other. The like-minded group, the low ambition countries, if you will, don't want to address production, don't want to address chemicals and plastics. And these are two really essential measures. So how we're going to get there is a good question for my policy expert friends. Moving beyond consensus and trying to find something effective, I think, is a very difficult task, but it needs to be done. This needs to be done because the crisis is urgent already today. There are peoples and countries in the world today that are facing crises that are already deadly.
Is there anything that ordinary people can do?
People can try to reduce their exposure by choosing foods that are not packaged in plastics or choosing not to buy, I would say, in the first hand, not to consume. But it's difficult for an individual to really address this problem because it's systemic. Plastics are in every part of our lives, every part of our societies, and we don't really know, as I said earlier, what's in them. We don't know what they're made out of. It's very difficult for consumers to affect that. So what we need is action from decision makers. So what consumers then can do is support their decision makers, support their governments, and doing ambitious choices around the plastics treaty.
All right, Bethanie Carney Almroth, thank you so much for your insight today. We'll be keeping an eye on this, of course. That's Bethanie Carney Almroth, a professor of ecotoxicology at the University of Gothenburg.